Hi all, in this video I'm going to discuss the problem of evil and some common responses to it. The problem of evil is a classical objection to the existence of a particular conception of God. It gets quite a lot of coverage by apologists, but rarely is it addressed well. Here I want to clearly lay out the argument and show the problems with the various responses. To begin with, let's see the argument. So, premise 1. If God exists, then he is all-powerful and morally good. Sub-premise 1.1. All-powerful means able to prevent all unnecessary suffering. Premise 1.2. Morally good means he would prevent all unnecessary suffering. Conclusion 1. Therefore, if God exists, he would prevent all unnecessary suffering. Premise 2. Unnecessary suffering exists. Conclusion 2. Therefore, God doesn't exist. In order to reject the conclusion that God doesn't exist, the theist must either reject at least one of the premises, or point out a logical fallacy. I will go through each of the premises, but before I do, I want to clarify a few points. Firstly, throughout the argument I refer to unnecessary suffering, and this concept is key to the argument. Any reasonable person will recognise that suffering is sometimes necessary, and so it can be morally good to cause or allow some suffering. For example, as a society we recognise that justice is often more important than an individual's suffering, and so we will punish people for committing crime in the interest of justice. In this case, the suffering caused by punishment is necessary to achieve justice. As a practical matter, we may disagree over the degree of suffering that is justified, but the principle is sound. Similarly, we will also condone suffering that is necessary in order to diminish overall suffering. For example, any surgery and many medical treatments inflict some suffering on the patient, but this is clearly justified if it avoids further suffering. A key consideration, though, is that it is only morally acceptable to inflict the amount of suffering that is strictly necessary for treatment. So, if I have two treatments that are identical in cost, effectiveness and availability, and differ only in the amount of side effects, it would be morally wrong to use the treatment that has the worst side effects. So, when I refer to unnecessary suffering, I mean any amount of suffering that is not justified by either reducing overall suffering or in furtherance of some other morally good goal. In practice, determining the precise amount of suffering that is justified is complicated, and beyond the abilities of humanity, but the principle is sound. For our purposes here, it is sufficient to distinguish between suffering that is necessary and suffering that isn't. The second thing to notice about the way that I've phrased the argument is that I've avoided the terms omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. The reason I've done that is because there are a number of issues with these terms, and whether they're even logically coherent. Also, these concepts are stronger than is necessary for the purposes of this argument. The problem of evil applies to any God concept that is sufficiently powerful to be able to prevent all unnecessary suffering, regardless of whether they are actually omnipotent, whatever that means. Similarly, we do not need to consider an omnibenevolent deity, only one that desires to prevent all unnecessary suffering. This is important in diffusing one of the common theistic responses. Now, let's go through each of the premises. Premise 1 says, if God exists, then he is all-powerful and morally good, which is simply the definition of God that I'm using. What I mean by this is clarified by our two sub-premises. Let's start with sub-premise 1.1. All-powerful means able to prevent all unnecessary suffering. This definition is not an exhaustive list of what is meant by the term all-powerful, but rather the one aspect of it relevant to this argument. Also, included in the idea of being able to prevent unnecessary suffering are some characteristics that are usually included in the terms omniscient and omnipresent. That is, implicit in the ability to prevent unnecessary suffering is, presumably, being aware of it and being in the correct location. I don't include this specifically as the actual mechanisms for preventing unnecessary suffering are unimportant. The key question is simply, does your God concept include the ability to prevent any and all unnecessary suffering in the world? Any mainstream follower of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam would have to answer in the affirmative. If your particular God is not sufficiently powerful, then this argument is not for you. Now, let's look at sub-premise 1.2. Morally good means he would prevent all unnecessary suffering. This, like subpremise 1.1, is not an exhaustive enumeration of the characteristics of moral goodness, only the particular trait of interest to this argument. Also, moral goodness here is equated with God taking action, rather than just a desire or disposition towards preventing unnecessary suffering. This is not because I'm making a meta-ethical argument that only actions are important, but rather to avoid such meta-ethical concerns. Here, all that is important is whether God's goodness actually translates into particular action. That is, whether God would actually prevent unnecessary suffering. The key question is simply, if it was within his power and he had no reason not to, would your God prevent suffering? Any mainstream Christian would have to answer in the affirmative. If your particular God wouldn't prevent such suffering, then this argument is not for you. Our first conclusion is really just a restatement of premise 1. That is, given the definitions in subpremises 1.1 and 1.2, we can conclude that if God exists, he would prevent all unnecessary suffering. The second premise is that unnecessary suffering exists. No one would argue that suffering doesn't exist, and as already discussed, there are obviously cases where suffering is necessary. The question is whether there is any suffering in the world that is not justified by some higher purpose or greater good. To the non-believer, this is obviously true, but not all believers accept this. In fact, the most common responses to the problem of evil consist of denying this premise. However, before getting to those objections, I want to tackle some others first. The first response I want to consider is the argument that goodness can only be understood by reference to God, and so the problem of evil rests on the assumption that God exists. This response can be interpreted in a few ways. Sometimes it's akin to the presuppositional argument, in that it is arguing that to discuss morality, we must first accept God. The problem with this is even if it was true, it would actually disprove God's existence. So to see this, suppose that we can only assert our first premise if we first accept the premise 0, God exists. The argument then reduces to, if God exists, then God doesn't exist. Now, this may seem like a paradox, but it isn't. It's actually just a straightforward argument that proves that God does not exist. To see this, notice that the argument is now serving as an argumentum ad absurdum, where we first assume that God exists and then derive a contradiction. Therefore, to argue that the problem of evil only works if God exists is actually to concede that God does not exist. The other meaning of this response is to suggest that the problem of evil commits the logical fallacy of borrowed concept. That is, that by referring to the idea of evil, or goodness, the atheist is referring to a concept that doesn't exist in a naturalistic worldview. Now, this is debatable, but it's actually irrelevant to the way that I have constructed the argument. While I do define God as being morally good, this is just a convenient shorthand for preventing unnecessary suffering. Nothing in the idea of unnecessary suffering is reliant on a theistic worldview, as it is easily grounded in the reality of human suffering. So the idea that the concept of goodness needs God does nothing to resolve this problem. The second response that I want to consider is one way of denying subpremise 1.2. The idea that a good God would prevent unnecessary suffering is sometimes denied by proponents of divine command theory. In essence, divine command theory states that things are good precisely because God does them or commands them. That is, there is no standard external to God by which we can judge an action, and therefore that God can choose not to prevent unnecessary suffering, and this would still be the action of a good God. Now, not all proponents of divine command theory take this option, with many asserting that God could choose not to prevent unnecessary suffering, but that he doesn't. Only some theists argue that God actually does choose not to prevent unnecessary suffering. While this is logically consistent, there are a number of issues with divine command theory, not least of which is that it is either equivocating or uninformative to declare God's actions to be good by definition. That is, when God commands someone to commit genocide, even for no reason, this is, by definition, a good thing. This is not what is usually meant by the word good, and certainly not the views of the majority of Christians. Essentially, the divine command theorist is saying that the phrase God is good is really just another way of saying God is God, which is hardly informative. They have conceded that God is not good by the usual definition of the word, and hence the problem of evil does not apply to their God, just as it doesn't apply to any other evil god. Now, the most common response to the problem of evil is called the free will defence. The modern form is due to Alvin Plantinga, and essentially argues that it is better to have a world with free will, even though this leads to suffering, than to have a world without free will. The key question to somebody appealing to the free will defence is all suffering in the world strictly necessary? That is there any suffering at all that is not logically necessitated by the existence of free will and other such considerations? If the free will defence only justifies some of the apparently unnecessary suffering, then the problem of evil remains. So the only logical option for the apologist is to claim that all suffering is, ultimately, necessary. Now, there are a number of philosophical problems with the free will defence, but the only one relevant here is that, on the face of it, it really only applies to suffering caused by people. It is not obvious how the free will defence is supposed to explain the existence of natural disasters, disease, or famine. The only way that these can be defended is by arguing that these are caused in some indirect way by humanity's free will. Young Earth creationists argue that this suffering was caused by Adam's sin in the Garden of Evil. More sophisticated theologians use more sophisticated words to make essentially the same argument. While this is, frankly, ridiculous, it is not logically contradictory, and so we will accept it for the time being. Before going further into the implications of rejecting premise 2, I want to mention another response that theists give. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. There are two ways in which this is invoked. Firstly, it is sometimes said as a way of arguing that we simply can't judge God by our limited human perspective. While this might be true, this actually concedes the argument. All that the problem of evil shows is that if a powerful God exists, then he can't be a good God. While this assessment of God's character is, of course, from our limited human perspective, that is, after all, the only perspective we have. To argue that God is actually good from a certain perspective concedes that he certainly isn't from ours. The other way in which the phrase, "the Lord moves in mysterious ways," is used is to argue that incidents of apparent unnecessary suffering may actually be part of a divine plan, or be in service of a higher goal. As noted previously, the real question is whether all such incidents can be explained this way, or just some. To the theist who is appealing to the possibility of an explanation for suffering, they need to either accept that some unnecessary suffering exists, in which case the problem of evil remains, or to claim that all suffering is ultimately necessary. I am unaware of any other common responses to the problem of evil. While a very small amount of theists may accept that their God is not sufficiently powerful, a few more will accept that their God does not meet the normal definition of morally good, the majority ultimately affirm that unnecessary suffering doesn't actually exist. That is, that all incidents of suffering in the world are justified by some other higher purpose or divine plan, such as the value of human free will, the effect of sin in the world, or as part of God's plan for humanity. This is logically consistent, but has important theological consequences that most Christians would be uncomfortable with. I have already made a video about this, and I'll put a link here and in the description box. So, to recap, here's the problem of evil. Premise 1. If God exists, then he is all-powerful and morally good. Subpremise 1.1. All-powerful means able to prevent all unnecessary suffering. Subpremise 1.2. Morally good means he would prevent all unnecessary suffering. Conclusion 1. Therefore, if God exists, he would prevent all unnecessary suffering. Premise 2. Unnecessary suffering exists. Conclusion 2. Therefore, God does not exist. The majority of theists confronted with this argument, in my experience, reject premise 2, and most responses ultimately come down to this. While it is certainly possible to reject premise 2, that has other theological consequences. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, see you next time.